Again. So in this video, we're going to take a look at async functions, and I'm going to go over the fundamentals of using async functions. Seeing a lot of questions in the different forums about using asynchronous function calls, especially with regards to stateful widgets. So I'm hoping after this video, you'll be more effective as a newcomer to Flutter because you'll understand asynchronous function calls and you'll be able to use the syntax. Once again, this video is brought to you by Rapido. Rapido is an open source library that brings rapid application development to Flutter. So you can go ahead and check out the tutorials online. Follow us on Twitter for new news, new video. Swing by Github. You can log any issues, ask any questions there, give us a star, and you can get Rapido from the pub.dartlang.org. And of course, subscribe to us here on YouTube. All these links will be in the description below. Okay, so let's get into it. First of all, just quickly, what is the difference between a synchronous versus an asynchronous function call? That's just a good place to start. So most function calls that you make are synchronous and you don't really think about it. Synchronous function call will block execution until that function call is done. So the next line of code after a synchronous function call won't fire until the synchronous function call is completed. Again, this is almost every function call that you make, you don't even think about it. But asynchronous function call is different. An asynchronous function call allows execution of the program to continue before the asynchronous function is complete. So the next line of code can go ahead and fire before the asynchronous function call is complete. If this is still not clear, that's okay. I think it'll become clear in the following example. Okay, so I wrote a program. The purpose of this program is just to show a line of text and to get that line of text from the internet. So to start with, it doesn't get the text from the internet. I've just hard-coded to create, just hard-coded a string here, text goes here. But I have stubbed out a function called set name from server, and I've created a mutable property in the state for the application called display string. So what I'm going to try to do is write a function called set name for server that sets the display string that then gets set in the then gets used in the build method of the application's widget. So let's take a look. Okay, so first I went ahead and I added display string so to use that variable in the text. And then I went ahead and I created the set name from server function. Now notice this code is not going to compile. That's okay, we'll make it compile in a bit. But first we need a way to call set name from server. So then we'll deal with this fact that this won't compile. Okay, so the first thing that you might think is, well, why don't I just call set name from server in the build function? Because it'll enter the build function, set the name, and then it'll work. So on the surface, this seems like a good idea. This is not. This is a terrible idea. You should not call any kind of long-running functions like something that hits the server from the build function. In Flutter, builds must be cheap. They get called all the time. They're supposed to be cheap. And doing some long-running function like getting something from the server is just going to cause you all kinds of problems. Not to mention if it's asynchronous, it's just going to be super confusing. So this is not a good way to do it. Fortunately, Flutter has quite a few good ways to do it, and as I mentioned in my last video, you can use the init state method. This function gets called first thing when the state gets created. So stateful widget has a state, and when the state gets created, the first thing that it calls is init state, which makes sense. So I'm going to call set name for server from init state. So the idea here is when the state's created, the first thing it's going to do is try to set the display string from the server. Okay, and then it goes ahead, and what it wants to do is to define the URL where we're going to get the that we're going to hit to get the text, creates an HTTP client, then uses the get function on that client to get a response, decode that response because it happens to be in JSON, and then set the display string. That's what I want to do, but again, this won't compile. And the reason this won't compile is because http.client.get does not return a response. It returns a future. It returns a future that is, in fact, as you can see here, templatized with the response object. Okay, so a future is a special kind of object that gets returned by asynchronous methods in Dart. Okay, and then you can do all kinds of things with them, and I'll show you what we can do. So the trick here is to use the future instead of trying to use the response directly. There's essentially three ways to handle a future. I'm going to cover the first in more detail. So the first way is to use the await keyword. And the await keyword will essentially turn your asynchronous function call into a synchronous function call. The other common way is to use the then function on a future. So every future has a function called then, which gets executed after the function is completed. And then you can also just grab the future and pass it around, do whatever you want with it. But we're not going to cover using futures directly like that. We're going to cover await and then because they're much more common. Okay, so now I'm making my code compile. So what I did was I added the await keyword, which then turns http.client.get essentially into a synchronous function that returns response. But to do that, I have to set the function set name from server as asynchronous using the async keyword. And this is going to introduce some complications. So now my code here is a lot simpler because it just means that the code's going to execute in order the way I would expect with synchronous functions. But let's take a closer look at what happens when I run the code. I have a bug. Okay, it crashes. And I can see when I look at it that the reason it's crashing is because I'm passing null into my text object. So when I create that text widget, I'm passing null into it. So that means that the display text function did not get set. Okay, so display string did not get set. And that's because set name from server is asynchronous. So what happens in terms of execution, let's just walk through execution from the point of view of the widget state object. Okay, so first thing that happens is it calls init state. Then it calls set name from server. Set name from server goes off and does its work because it's asynchronous. It doesn't wait for set name from server to finish. It just goes right ahead and calls the super function for init state. That means then that the init state function is done, and then it goes ahead and calls the build function, which then returns the scaffold. Okay, and therein is the bug. At no point in this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps did the display string get set. Okay, so it's when I look in a little more detail, what's happening is when set name from server gets called, these functions, these lines of code then do get called in sequence, but on in a totally different world, right? So you see set name from server gets called, and then to A, to B, to C, to D, to E, these lines of code each get called in order, but there's no way for the widget to see A, B, C, D, and E, right? Because it just called the set name from server and then went about its normal execution. Fortunately, there's an easy way in Flutter to fix this. Okay, so you may recall from my last video that I just need to add a set state function in here. So what a set state does is then when I set the display string in this async function, by calling it within set state, that tells it to set the display string and then call build again. Okay. The other thing that I did is just because it's good practice, I don't like to leave the chance of crashes lying around, is I use an empty string instead of a null value. Okay, so now what will happen is the build function will get called while setName for server is executing. Then, when setName from server gets the response back and parses it and sets it, the build function will be called again after the display string is set. And in this way, now my program works. Now let's quickly look at another way to manage or to use an async function using the then keyword. So here, instead of making the http.client.get function synchronous using the await keyword, I use the then function on the future that gets returned. And this changes the flow of execution somewhat. So what the then function does says go ahead and execute this code. When it's done, execute whatever function I pass into the then function. Okay, so then is a function that takes a function as an argument, and I'm just passing in an anonymous function here, which is the most common way that you'll see this written. So let's take a closer look at how the execution goes. So here, init state gets called first, as before. setName gets called first, as before. But notice setName from server is no longer asynchronous. Therefore, execution does not skip over setName for server, it goes into it. So the variable string URL gets set, the HTTP client gets created, then the asynchronous http.client.get function gets called. Execution continues. There's no more code to execute in there. So that finishes. Init state gets called. Then init state is done, which means it goes on to the build function and then returns. So you still have the same situation where display string is an empty string the first time build gets called. But in the meantime, when the HTTP client.get asynchronous function returns its future, then you call then on that future, and then this function then gets executed. So then it'll decode the response body and then call set state as normal. Okay, so that's how to use await, and that's how to use then to work with asynchronous functions in your Flutter code. So I hope you found that useful. Drop a note in if you have any more questions. Just go ahead and drop in a comment. Give the video a like. Swing by GitHub and take a look at the Rapido code. Thank you.